Here's a question for you. Should we make reading Aristotle compulsory in school? You're probably going to say no. And I'm going to say no too, with a proviso. But I'm going to say no probably for very different reasons than you are. And if you're one of the people who actually says, yes, that's a really great idea, I'm in sympathy with you, but I would also lay down certain demands that would make it practically not impossible, but pretty difficult for you to realize that. So here's my rant. About a week and a half ago, I got into an interesting discussion, actually a little bit of a debate on Twitter. And it was fairly amicable as far as Twitter goes. You know, that can be kind of a cesspool as far as discussions. The character limits, you don't get me started on all of that because there's a lot that can be said about that. And it had to do with this question of making reading of Aristotle compulsory in schools. Now, it didn't specify whether we're talking about kindergarten through 12th grade or college or any other kinds of schools, just schools. And the person who started it off said compulsory reading of Aristotle in school would do a lot more good for the country than any other social experiment on offer. So it's coming from, what we can guess to be a fairly, traditionalist, right-wing, conservative perspective, not necessarily one that is, just populist or anything like that, because I think suggesting Aristotle is already fairly anti-populist if you know your Aristotle. And I responded by saying this, and this is what got the discussion going. Compulsory reading of Aristotle, that would turn students off for life. Aristotle requires competent teaching and application to be useful. So I'm making 2 points there. And then one of my interlocutors, not the original poster, but somebody else, chimed in and said, these don't seem to be mutually exclusive. And if you look at the Twitter conversation, you can see that I messed with him a little bit, and said, teaching and application aren't really mutually exclusive. And he said, no. What I mean is making it compulsory and teaching it, applying it competently. And I said, yeah, you're right. They're not mutually exclusive. Whoever claimed that they were, as a matter of fact, I would go so far, and here is my position on this, to say that if you want to teach Aristotle in school, let alone make Aristotle compulsory, well, then you'd better find some people who are competent teachers who really know the stuff. And then you have to go beyond that. Reading is not enough. In order for you to take a moral philosopher, particularly somebody with the complexity and depth and richness of Aristotle's thought, it's got to be application and even real-life applications to the lives of the students, or it's not going to click. It's not going to matter. And if you can't do that, then don't talk about making it compulsory, because all you're doing then is setting students up to be turned off and to never read Aristotle in their life. So if your goal is to actually get people to read Aristotle, or going beyond that, to take what's in his text that's of such great value and start changing their lives, changing their communities with it, well, by God, you'd better have some competent expositors in the classroom, people who really know the text, really know what they're doing. It's not enough to have fans who, were told in some history of philosophy that Aristotle did this and that, and that's a good thing. You need to actually read your Aristotle, understand it, and you'd better know where you disagree with Aristotle and why you disagree with him. Otherwise, you can't be a good teacher of Aristotle. So I got a lot to say about this, and I'm going to go through these points one by one, not necessarily in a logical order, but I think that this is stuff that could be quite thought-provoking for many people. So let me say from the start that I'm actually probably a bigger fan of Aristotle than most of the people who would find this idea of reading Aristotle compulsory think themselves to be, in part because I've spent more than half of my life actually reading Aristotle, reading him in the original, or at least as close to it as we can get, the critical versions in Greek of his text. I've written on Aristotle, I've presented on Aristotle, I've given talk after talk after talk about Aristotle. I've applied Aristotle within the context of executive coaching, life coaching, philosophical counseling. So you can guess I'm somebody who really, really is a fan of Aristotle. And I'm not going to be saying, oh, no, don't have students read that stuff without some good reason to say that. So what is my good reason? Well, Aristotle is pretty hard. When I first read Aristotle, I couldn't make heads or tails of half of it, and the other half, I said, well, this is just plain common sense, or it's boring. That was, many, many years ago, and I didn't actually have competent teachers to help me through it. And I started out with Aristotle's Categories and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But I had a sort of adverse reaction to Aristotle as a smart student. So imagine just throwing these books in students' hands and saying, go to it, Johnny. Go to it, Susie. Read some Aristotle. Let's talk about it later. Well, that's going to have almost the opposite reaction of what you want. What you need is people who really understand the text to sit down with students and, take manageable portions, manageable chunks, and say, we're going to work through this. And then, if you're going to keep reading it, see how the different texts are interconnected with each other, which sometimes you can't really do unless you can read Greek, or unless you, have somebody else who reads Greek for you show you where these connections are. So I'm probably one of the biggest fans of Aristotle, and I'm going against the other Aristotle fans who are, you might say, fans in the sense of just they really like the stuff that he's putting out. They have an emotional attachment to it, but they don't really get into it quite so much. I would also add, too, that other Aristotle scholars are going to be with me on this. One of the people who I particularly like, both personally and in terms of his thought, is Alistair McIntyre. He's got a great piece called Plain Persons and Moral Philosophy that I use when I teach ethics classes. And in it, he talks about the ordinary person is probably a proto-Aristotelian, which is why there can be some traction. And he says, the worst thing we could possibly do is just throw the Nicomachean Ethics at students and say, here, read up on this. It's going to really change your life. Because they're going to open it up and say, what the hell is this? I don't know what he's talking about here. Everything has ends. Virtuous activity, all sorts of side discussions about, can the dead be happy? What the hell is this stuff, right? McIntyre recognizes, he says, we have to do a lot of interpretation for these students, and it makes total sense. We're not living in the 4th century BC, right? These works were written for different contexts. That doesn't mean that they're not applicable today, but we can't do it in a cookie-cutter sort of way. We actually have to do a lot of adaptation. We have to do a lot of application. We have to do a lot of getting students to see that this connects up with and illuminates their experience. And in order to do that, you have to have done some of that in your own life with the Aristotle. And not in a, again, cookie-cutter schematic way. Aristotle's thought is incredibly flexible. The way in which many people apply him is not. Now here I'm going to go into another digression. When we're talking about making, reading and study as something compulsory within the curriculum, I think that, if you know your history of ideas and you know anything about what scholasticism had turned into and why the early modern philosophers were reacting against that and why scholastic became kind of a byword and, a way to denigrate somebody, you won't be so eager to do that with students. People like Thomas Hobbes, Rene Descartes, they read their Aristotle. They had plenty of people who said, well, the answers to this problem are in this text. Just read it, and it'll all work out. And it didn't satisfy them. Why not? Because it was badly taught. It wasn't really well thought out. And when it came to the places where Aristotle actually turned out to be wrong, people tried to figure out ways they could jigger it to make sure that, he didn't turn out to be wrong. And, why would we want to replicate something like that today? I just can't see that. I would love, let me preface this by saying, I would love to see every student in our nation, in the United States, actually every student across the world, reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, reading his Politics, reading the On the Soul, reading all sorts of Aristotelian works, the Rhetoric, too, I'm particularly fond of. And I'd like to see them read it not just once to get it over with and take a test on it, but to go back to it over and over and over again. But I know that if we want that to happen, we have to approach it in a very different way. We can't just impose this on students as if somehow they're just going to respond to it. And the people who we would have doing the initial exposition and interpretation and application, I don't think that most of them would be up to it. I mean, think about the current crop of K through 12 teachers, or the current crop of probably philosophy professors in universities and colleges. I wouldn't, as an Aristotle scholar and as somebody who teaches Aristotle and somebody who loves Aristotle, I wouldn't trust 99% of them to competently teach Aristotle and to do so in a way that wouldn't manage to turn students off. 99%, I would say, at this point in time. Maybe among philosophy professors, maybe I'd say only 80% would get that from me. But I know from interacting with them, from presenting papers at conferences to my peers, how few of them actually remember very much from their reading of Aristotle as students. Now, what would be the prospect? We could, of course, have some sort of curriculum in training the trainers, in educating the educators. But who would put that into play? Would we find some big institution to back that up the way that, say, Gates backed up the Common Core? I mean, if we could, that would be great. I'd be happy to spearhead that initiative. That would be a worthwhile thing for me to do with my life. If somebody wanted to throw a lot of money at it, I would happily educate educators in how to lead students into Aristotle. But until that's going to happen, what we'd be stuck with are the run-of-the-mill, for the most part, with the occasional person who really is good at it and cares about Aristotle and understands Aristotle. So, the person that I was interacting with is totally right. Compulsory reading of Aristotle, competent teaching of Aristotle, they're not mutually exclusive at all. I would go so far as to say you can't really have one without having the other. So let's put it as an if-then, and a practical if-then. If you have competent teaching, exposition, interpretation, application, then it makes sense to make reading of Aristotle compulsory. But if you don't have that, condition, then it would be a terrible idea to make reading of Aristotle compulsory. It would be counterproductive. It would turn more students off from Aristotle. It would turn them away from Aristotelian modes of thinking, which are very powerful, which, again, I use in my own practice and with my clients, and I teach to students, and I see them successfully apply in their own life. There's a few other things I want to say about this as well. What's the mindset that thinks that just by making reading a particular author compulsory across the board, that we would produce some useful social change? I think that has happened a lot on the left, but I think this is a great example of that happening on the right as well. It's not people on the left who are saying, oh man, we got to make people read Aristotle. Instead, it's whatever flavor of the month happens to be for, is going to change people's consciousness by confronting them with this book. It's mostly people on the right who are saying, yeah, we got to have people read Aristotle. Do these really work out that way? Does just merely throwing material at people change their mindsets? What is the mindset that thinks that works? That's what I'd like to ask right there. And then, we can think about the broader context. Should we make any sort of reading compulsory? Or, if we really care about students and we really care about our society and we think that something is a valuable text and it's not something that's, immediately grasped, because almost nothing that's worthwhile is immediately grasped. That's in a way a sign of a mediocre text, the fact that anybody can get it automatically. It's probably wrong, too. If we're going to make things compulsory, we really owe it to our students to find people who understand that stuff that we're doing. And if we have to train them, then we have to train them. If they have to train themselves in order to be competent expositors, great. That's part of what education is about. If you're an educator, your education should be going on for your life. It's not like you get your sheepskin and now you're ready to teach. You need to be doing continual education, and you should be more passionate about the things that you're teaching than your beginning level students who are getting into it for the first time and getting excited about it. There should be a slow burn going on throughout your life and your teaching. You should be better educated by the end of your life than you are at the midpoint in your career. That's not the case, unfortunately, much of the time. So, to bring this to a close, should we make reading Aristotle compulsory in school? Yes, if we're going to have an entire cadre and cohorts of great educators who can competently explain and interpret Aristotle and show students how to apply it to their own lives. If we're not going to do that, then the answer is no.